Good morning. Just a schedule note. We'll have this morning and next week, Mitzvah Hashem. Those will be our two final Sunday morning shiurim for the season. And then the next Sunday afterwards is Tisha B'Av. We'll take a break for a few weeks and resume Chodesh Elul, Be'ezras Hashem. Figured we had the last two shiurim exploring different ideas from the world of Rav Kook. We saw a little bit into his sefer Ikvei Tzon. We did a piece in that together, and then last time we saw the unapologetic approach and conviction that Rav Kook had regarding different areas of Hashkafa. I wanted to transition and explore the great debate that took place in the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, the great MUSSAR debate. Now, when you think of the world of MUSSAR, the name Rav Kook usually doesn't come to mind. We don't picture him in the MUSSAR world. However, it's interesting, Rav Kook himself felt a very close connection to Rav Yisrael Salanter. He never met him personally. Rav Yisrael passed away when Rav Kook was 18 years old. Rav Kook was then a Talmud in Volozhin, and he had such a strong hargasha about the loss of Rav Yisrael Salanter that he tore kriya as if he was his Rebbe Muvok. So I figured we'll start off with a beautiful essay that Rav Kook wrote in 1933. This is 2 years before he passed away. An essay that he wrote on the 50th yard site of Rav Yisrael Salanter, giving us a little bit of an insight and a description of the greatness of his personality and his contribution. And then I want to see the words of Rav Yisrael himself and the description and the expansion of Rav Yisrael Salanter's philosophy by his great Talmud, Rav Itzala. Yossi, you need a marmakomos? No, so we could have people could share. No. We're talking about MUSSAR, so we have to be able to share a little bit.
We don't need many lights.
Rav Itzala, we know, is one of the three main disciples of Rav Yisrael Salanter, and he has an entire sefer where he describes the methodology and the innovation of Rav Yisrael's understanding of MUSSAR and what he felt was necessary for the masses and for the Talmidei Chachamim of his time, and obviously and beyond. So we'll start off with this hesped that Rav Kook gave in 1933, 50 years after the passing of Rav Yisrael. We'll see a little bit of Rav Yisrael's philosophy through the lens of Rav Itzala, and then we'll leave off with a few questions, I think, for this week. And then next week we'll get involved with some of the fierce opposition, right? Surprisingly fierce opposition. You would think, what's bad potentially about learning MUSSAR and developing one's midos and refining your character? It sounds like a wonderful thing. What could possibly be wrong with the Limud HaMussar? We'll see a little indication or some maybe strange things that we might not be familiar with when going through Rav Itzala's understanding of Rav Yisrael's approach. And then next week we'll see from Rav Chaim Brisker the way that he expressed his concern over the MUSSAR movement. And then we'll go back to Rav Kook. Rav Kook actually in an earlier essay that he wrote in 1905 where he expressed also hesitation on at least how Rav Yisrael's vision was being implemented. Okay. So writes Rav Kook here on page 1, it's impossible to give any kind of toar, any kind of picture to a man of his stature. And for sure, somebody like myself, I never met him before in person. However, I've heard so many incredible things about Rabbi Yisrael from valid, reliable sources. Asher ze yuval shonim nimla me'oz nignaz aron hakodesh. It's been a yovel, rather, from the time that the Aron HaKodesh has been hidden. meaning since the passing of Rav Yisrael, and it's avoda kasha to write anything that could describe his godless, his kedusha, his splendor. Nonetheless, I feel that I can't exempt myself from trying to express some of my feelings. For one reason, which is that it's important for us to know and for generations to come to view Rabbi Yisrael as a banner, as somebody to strive towards, both his personality and his vision of MUSSAR. I'll share with you, interesting, in a letter that Rav Kook has, when he speaks about the learning of MUSSAR, but also Panemius HaTorah, and we'll delve more into what the difference is between MUSSAR in contrast to Panemius HaTorah. Rav Kook says about himself, and as we've seen in previous letters, he was very open about his feelings. Anochi keshani la'atzmi. I'll tell you that personally, Baruch Hashem rachok milios nena harbe kishim mishabchin osi. I don't get a lot of pleasure when people praise me or speak highly of me. V'lo lios mitztayr makbid harbe kishim mevazin osi. Nor am I totally destroyed or distraught when people put me down. Shavach lishmo yisbarach. I thank Hashem for this. She'esek hatamidi belimud hamusar upanimius Torah hakadosha pol alai zos hatachuna. He says it's not because naturally I'm such an anav, not because naturally the praise of others doesn't make me feel good, or the rejection of others doesn't cause me to feel somewhat down, but it's through my asik tamidi belimud hamusar v'panimius haTorah, through my constant, diligent work in MUSSAR and Panemius, I was able to develop this techuna, this personality, where these types of external things don't faze me as much. So Rav Kook himself was clearly not only in hashkafa promoting MUSSAR, but he's telling us that he himself learned MUSSAR consistently. So he continues here in his hesped for Rabbi Yisrael. The greatest desire of Rav Yisrael Salanter was to stay b'hatznei aleches. B'chol kocho musari elyon almost shalo lihisvada l'rabim, and he tried with every fiber of his being not to be known to the masses. Lo haisa shum efsharo she'ornera v'nifla kizeh. However, it was impossible to keep this brilliant and radiant light from expanding and exploding outwards. V'chol Yisrael beyichud gedolei hador v'anshe esgula, to the point where the entirety of Klal Yisrael, and especially the gedolei hador, became aware of this Ish Elokim Kodosh Gon Hador Upolochai B'Socham. Rabbi Yisrael, we're going to learn about momentarily, was very influenced by Reb Zundel Misalant. Reb Zundel Misalant was one of the main Talmidim of Rav Chaim Volozhin, and we know that Rav Chaim was one of the main disciples of the Gra. So Reb Zundel was in that direct dynasty, that legacy of the Vilna Gaon. And Rav Zundel, for the majority of his life, he was a nister. He lived in Salant, hence the last name, but he made it his avoda that no one should pick up on the brilliance, on his godless, on his mastery of Torah, and he really hid that well. We'll see, though, there were a few people living in Salant that were able to peek behind the curtain, and Rabbi Yisrael was one of them. Rabbi Yisrael discovered his godless, and he wanted to emulate his great Rebbe by also remaining a nister. However, like Rav Kook is alluding to, that was not the calling of Rabbi Yisrael. He couldn't contain that light, and he had to share it with the world. Gaonis Elyona explains Rav Kook that when it comes to great brilliance, it comes in two flavors. You have the Kishron HaSichli, brilliance of the intellect, and then you also have the Kishron HaRitzoni, which literally means the brilliance of the will, of the drive, of the world of emotion. And you'll have different Gedolim throughout the centuries who really thrive or excel in one of those areas. With Rav Yisrael Salanter, one of the incredible unique qualities of the personality was Or Olam Zeh Zocha L'Shnei Haksarim Be'orach Pella. Rabbi Yisrael was zocha to have the crowns of both the Kishron HaSichli and the Kishron HaRitzoni. He was a goin adir in all areas of Shas and Poskim, with his charifis and his bekiyas, his sharpness and his vast knowledge, coming to a place of such a quality in Torah that he was revered amongst other gedolim of the time. Ubechol zos, but nonetheless, he was extremely in touch with his koach haratzon, the emotion that poured out of the neshama of Rabbi Yisrael was something that people would stand in awe of, and almost it was infectious. Now, for some reason, and Rav Kook says we don't know why, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter himself did not write much. The writings we have of Rabbi Yisrael are pretty much contained in the Sefer Or Yisrael, and those are 30 letters that were compiled by Rabbi Itzel Petterberger, right, one of his 3 disciples. Rabbi Yisrael said about himself, he said, the truth is, if I had time to devote to writing, I could write tshuvas like the Noda B'Yehuda, no problem. But I have to focus all of my energies on what I feel is my purpose in life, which is the spreading of MUSSAR. The last line here on page 1, Reb Kook says, "V'chol yitzirus and niflos halalu hayu mischadshos b'mehirus pilois b'chol eis hadorush." Not only was he incredible in his intellect, but the speed of thought of Rabbi Yisrael was something that was like in a different world, Kamara Habetzik, mamish like a lightning bolt. And this is the famous story. Now, there's so many stories about every gadol, and naturally we have to be skeptical of everything because we're Jewish, and that's okay. However, stories that come from a direct testimony of other Gedolei Yisrael, those are stories that obviously carry a lot of weight. This is one of them. Naftali Amsterdam, he was one of the other disciples of Rabbi Yisrael. He was the one who shared with the world the famous story. Rabbi Yisrael was going to a place to give a shiur, and like he always did, he would post the Mar Makomos a week or 2 before, so the scholars of the town would have a time to go through them and study to be prepared for the shiur. And there were 2 people who were very anti the MUSSAR movement, and they wanted to play games with Rabbi Yisrael. So they took the Mar Makomos down. There were like 50, 60, 70 Mar Makomos. And instead, they wrote random sources all throughout Shas and Poskim. Mamish random. Gemaras and Chulin, and the Rambam in the middle of nowhere, and the Marik. And they posted that instead. So when Rabbi Yisrael got up to the podium to give the drasha, and the Mar Makomos were placed before him, he recognized right away, these are not the Mar Makomos I sent in. Instead, they're random sources. So he paused for 3 minutes, just standing there, and then he went into an elaborate drasha utilizing every one of those sources. Stayed in the Gemara and Chulin, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, and he tied it into the Rambam somehow in the Goyim. It was a brilliant sight to behold. And Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam says, I was standing there witnessing this like spark of genius. Now, the reason why Rabbi Yisrael did this was because in order to promote any movement in Klal Yisrael, for you or I to get up there and, I think we should learn more MUSSAR. Okay, shkoyach, right? However, if you're a gadol and you can share your greatness in Torah with others who are also gedolim to the point where they have a respect and a reverence for you, then you have more of a forum to be able to share what you feel is the right thing for Klal Yisrael. There's still going to be pushback, which is always healthy, right? Innovation is something that should be looked at very carefully, but at least you have the potential to make real changes when you're someone of that stature. They knew, yeah, he knew immediately. They're playing games with me. They're trying to be mavaza me, to be mavaza my movement. And he took advantage of the opportunity. Now, the part that's not so well known about this story is that Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam said Why did it take him 3 minutes? Right? Why did it take him 3 minutes? Not because he needed that time to recall all of the sources. He could have looked at the paper and just put something together.
So that they would know that he had to reformulate.
So Reb Naftali said, I don't know for sure, but my hunch is that he was working through an inner turmoil as to whether or not it was appropriate to display this level of brilliance. He says that's my understanding of my Rebbe, and he came to the conclusion that on behalf of Klal Yisrael to be able to spread the importance of MUSSAR, I think it's okay. So Rav Kook is alluding to this idea when he says it was mamish not only genius, but it was genius like a bolt of lightning with incredible speed. On the top of page 2, he says all of this wealth of ruchnius, right? These two crowns of the Kishron Hasichli and the Kishron Ritzoni, Rabbi Yisrael, channeled towards uplifting the Jewish people. Lavodas Hashem Yisborach L'Shem Shemayim. Im HaShe'ifa Lahatzdik Chevrosi. He says one of his main goals, as we find through many of the stories of Rabbi Yisrael and much of his writing that we have, is that he wanted to have more of a focus on the Bein Adam Lechavero. And he would speak about this often. He would give hadracha and tochacha. And it would pain him greatly when he would see a lack of sensitivity between human beings. And it would pain him even more greatly, says Rav Kook, when he would see a corruption of Torah in the sense where people were machshiv and they were giving importance and time and effort to ben adam lamakom, to the relationship between man and God. But when it comes to ben adam lechavero, that wasn't viewed as a religious pursuit. That's more, it's humanism, that's not Yiddishkeit. He said that would cause Yisrael, Rabbi Yisrael, the greatest amount of pain. Harayon shehikif eschayev. But this was the theme that encompassed his whole life, was to find the cure. It's a beautiful mashal. Rav Kook is not making up this language. In the letters of Rabbi Yisrael, we find the way that he refers to learning MUSSAR is a refuah. It's the healing process that every human being needs to tap into. So just like you have, I remember speaking to a friend of mine, the Goldman family from Chafetz Chaim, right? So Dr. Goldman, who passed away recently, so his father was an incredible physician, and he was very involved with research. And I forget exactly what he was instrumental in helping discover, but I heard from his grandchildren that for the last part of his life, the last 20 years or so, he was focused on finding a cure for Parkinson's. And unfortunately, he never did. But just that she'ifa, that ambition of actually trying to find a cure, spending your whole life, that's like the ultimate l'shem shemayim. I remember myself personally when we were very involved with the medical world when Avram was born with neutropenia, and we were talking with all the specialists in the field and going to different conferences. I was so amazed by at least the doctors who were involved in the research. It's true the Gemara says, Tov shebirofim legehenim. There's definitely a concern of real arrogance when it comes to the world of medicine. But the doctors who were involved with the research, I've never seen personally in a secular, quote-unquote, pursuit, that level of l'shem shemayim that I saw by these individuals. I went to a conference one time with my wife where they had all 6 people throughout the country who were mamish the top in this field, which is a very rare disease, come together in Arizona. And all families, pretty much, who had children with neutropenia came as well. And I was assuming, based on my my culture being in yeshiva, when you have a Adam Gadol, everyone, hacks him and surrounds him, and it's hard to get a word in with him. I was assuming that all these great doctors, they're going to be surrounded by the families. I'll probably have a chance to ask 1 or 2 questions. And I get to this conference, and I see all the families are sitting there, during breakfast. And the doctors are there in their own table, drinking their coffee, eating their bagels. And I was astounded. I realized, though, once you leave the Jewish world, people don't have that same obnoxious behavior of like going over to the expert in the field and asking them every question you ever had. So I had to be very careful. Take advantage, but don't be obnoxious. So the description of Rav Yisrael was he had that same passion, lahavdil, for the finding the cure, the healing of the ruchniistic machla for Klal Yisrael, letachule nefesh, lahamon hapashut lefi erko, for all of the masses according to their ability, and la'anshe maila gedolei Torah, and even the anshe maila, the gedolei Torah, they're also in need of a refuah. Hu hisbonin kama mukahi machle shel hesach hadas mehabikoras atzmitz. Very beautiful way that Rav Kook explains the recognition of Rav Yisrael. He said he saw that there was a hesach hadas, there was a distraction, there was a lack of focus when it came to really reflecting and looking into oneself. Masha nashim heinam trudim o b'chai yom yom chamarim. He saw people were constantly distracted. And this is even before technology as we know it. What were they distracted by? Either just the daily grind of life, o b'hatirdus hasichlim shalahem, or even the distraction of the sichli, of the intellect, exploring chachma, or even exploring Torah. Ve'ein masim alev limtzo es atzmo besaras achayim. This line should be underlined, as it is. They didn't take the time to find themselves within the storm of life. Is that beautiful? V'sakona tzafuya la'amodas haTorah v'yadus, and he realized that this lack of focus presented a real danger to the entirety of Torah and true Yiddishkeit. Now it's true, we definitely had people well before Rav Yisrael Salanter speak about MUSSAR and write classic MUSSAR svarim. What was the first MUSSAR sefer ever to be composed? Oh, okay. That's a good answer. Right? Koheles or Mishle. Okay. How about post-Tanakh? I remember hearing from Reb Reuven Feinstein. Okay, good. I'm looking for something a little bit later on in history, but I want to tell you what Reuven said. We were talking to him at a Kiddush one time, talking about MUSSAR, and he said, you know what the best MUSSAR sefer is in the world? The classic Reb Reuven. So I said, what? He said, Sefer Devarim. But the first MUSSAR sefer as we know it was, even before Sha'arei Tshuva, Chovos HaLevavos, right? That was the first Rabbeinu Bechaya. He wrote the Chovos Levavos in the 11th century. That's the first official classic MUSSAR sefer. So this has been a genre well before Rabbi Yisrael's time. Rabbi Yisrael was born in 1810, passed away in 1883. So hundreds of years before Rabbi Yisrael. However, not only do we have the medieval MUSSAR Svarim and the classic text Mesilas Yesharim, which we'll learn in a moment, was the sefer given to him by none other than Reb Zindel Misalant. Reb Zindel told Reb Yisrael, all Sifrei MUSSAR are incredible, but this should be your guiding light, Mesilas Yesharim. However, with all of the history and all of the rich literature we had in the realm of MUSSAR, B'chol zos matzahu zal barucha hagadol sheyesh od mad lehosef, Rabbi Yisrael found within his great spirit there is more to add. Shilachachmas ha-MUSSAR v'hayira hadrusha ma'od lefi matziv shel hador. And this is also a very important idea. When it comes to MUSSAR and Yira and Hashkafa, Panemius HaTorah, whatever it exactly is you call it, it has to be lefi ha-matziv shel hador. It has to fit with the generation. You have to know how to speak to people who are living now. So Shum kova ba mismaros u'masar nafsho Allah, and therefore he gave his life for the enhancement of Limud HaMussar, which he felt was the ultimate cure for the Jewish people.
Could the Rav expand exactly what's the illness? I mean, it seems a little, at least according to Rav Kook, what, like you're talking about a door illness. What is the illness? What does that mean?
So what is the illness is a good question. And what makes it more complex, like we'll see next week, not everyone agreed that they suffered from that illness, right? So it was a machla that he spent his whole life trying to find the cure for, when you had other gedolim saying, I don't think it's really a problem, right? The way that Rav Kook is describing it in very broad terms is a hesech hadas, which means living with a sense of ongoing distraction from the important things in life. Coming closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, refining one's midos, bein adam lamakom, in the areas that are not as tangible, like emunah and bitachon, and bein adam lechavero, something that was not really understood to be part of Yiddishkeit. So within that realm, Rav Yisrael felt that there was just a lack of clarity. Right? The famous story that's also documented from many sources is the Makkah Patish. The thing that really encouraged him to start this mission was the era of Yom Kippur Maisa, where he was trying to figure out what time it was, and he found an elderly Jew walking to shul who was very immersed in his tshuva process, getting ready for the Yom Hadin Hagadol, and he asked him, excuse me, what time is it? And he didn't respond. And he asked him again. He thought maybe he didn't hear him, but it was clear after asking a second time that the fellow heard Rabbi Yisrael, but he didn't feel it was important enough to interrupt his tshuva process to answer his fellow Jew. And in that moment, Rabbi Yisrael said, we're definitely missing the boat. So we'll call it a hesech hadas. That was the machla. It was just the lack of focus, a lack of understanding, or we'll see more. It was a lack of an emotional clarity of machal vaso ba'olam, of what are we doing here? What are we actually here in our short time in Olam Hazeh? What are we trying to accomplish? Okay, so that was parts of the hesped that Rav Kook gave. Let's jump briefly into some of the actual writings of Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer explaining the innovation of Rabbi Yisrael. We're on page 4. Let's start from the third line here. The way that Rabbi Yitzchak always refers to his Rebbe is in the most glowing terms. Admor Hagon Hagodol Hachosid Hamiti Kodosh Yisrael Zecher Tzadik Kodosh Levracha Schuso Yogin Aleinu Meir Salant V'chein Bimei Elumo Yotzak Mayim Al Yad Ish Kodosh V'Nora. When Rabbi Yisrael was a young man, he poured water onto the hands of an Ish Kodosh V'Nora. That expression of pouring water over the hands we find from Navi, that Elisha poured water over the hands of Eliyahu, and that, the Gemara says, is a way of showing that he was Mishamesh, right? He was serving Eliyahu. Rabbi Yisrael served Rabbi Yosef Mizalant. Hagon Hagadol Lachasid Va'onav Or Olam Kodosh Hashem Mechubed Marona Yosef Zundel Misalant Hamafursam Befi Kol Bishmo Reb Zundel Misalant. Talmid Choviv. So who was Reb Zundel? He was a beloved Talmid of Rav Chaim Mivolozhin, who, as we know, Rav Chaim was a Talmid of the Gra. Shimesh es Rabbo Bekodesh, and he served his Rebbe in Kedusha, and he received from his Rebbe the ways of MUSSAR and Yira and Avodas Hashem. So what he's doing here in this first paragraph is he's giving a legitimacy to the approach of Rav Yisrael. He's saying it wasn't just a chiddush he came up from within his own neshama, but it was his shimush, it was his experience and exposure with Rav Zundel Misalant, who was a Talmud of Rav Chaim, who was just passing along the Masorah from the Gra. So this goes back to the holiest and the most authentic sources. Now, the way of Rav Zundel is that he would learn MUSSAR. I'm in the second paragraph here. B'chol yom b'hisbonenus rav. It wasn't just learning, but it was hisbonenus, real deep contemplation. And then he would review psukim of Yir and Ava, or different Maimari Chazal that he felt really touched him. He would cherry pick those psukim or those words of Chazal, and he would say them over and over again, and he would go out from the city into the field to review those words of Chazal. And on Shabbos, during the long nights in the winter, he was machmer not to learn by any kind of light, and instead he would review those Maimari Chazal in his head, focusing on different concepts of bitachon and emunah and avas Hashem and avas habrios. Rabbi Yisrael, as a young man, betal yalduso, this is the beginning of the third paragraph, he observed the conduct of Reb Zundel carefully. And he saw that there were times that Reb Zundel would leave the Beis Medrash and walk outside into the fields, and he was curious, what was he doing outside? So he followed him b'acheva in a hidden way, and he saw that Reb Zundel would get outside away from everyone else, and he would say over these different Maimari Chazal or Psukim in a manner that was like hislavus, like a fire. And he observed this carefully, but one time, Reb Zundel noticed that he was being followed by Rabbi Yisrael, so he turned around. And the line that he said, writes Reb Itzela, is a line that I heard directly from my Rebbe, Rabbi Yisrael. And Rabbi Yisrael told me that when he heard this line from Reb Zundel Misalant, it changed his life forever. What was that line? Reb Zundel, noticing that Rabbi Yisrael was there watching him and listening to him, he said, Yisrael, let's find the line here. Where are we, everybody? Side the third paragraph. Yisrael, the last word in the line, a little bit past the halfway point. Lamod Musar utehei yarei shemayim. Simple instructions. You don't have to keep on looking at me and admiring me. You learn Musar and you'll have real, healthy, transformative Yirei Shemayim. You'll become a Yarei Shemayim. Those words were Yardu l'so chadre levavo kechetz mikeshes. Those enter the heart of Rabbi Yisrael mamish like an arrow, and it was at that point on that he devoted his life to the learning and eventually the spreading of Musar. We'll turn the page here to page 5. What was the innovation of Rabbi Yisrael? So he explains that there were really two parts to the movement. One was the etzem chovas limud hayira v'hamusar, trying to bring back, somewhat of a lost art. The idea of learning Musar consistently and daily, that it should be a focus in your life. And then based, the second part of the innovation, this is probably the main chiddush of Rabbi Yisrael, was the ofen, the way how to learn Musar, where it actually has a hispilus, it creates an inner movement and transformation. So he focuses here on the second part. What does it mean to learn Musar in a particular way that it will change you? So he says, Admar Zal b'chachmaso shina es panei limud hamusar. He changed the way that people learn Musar. V'yalbish osa tzura acheres. He gave it a different form. Gam mishalam l'pa'amim ezeh sifrei Musar. What did people used to do? You open up a Chovos Levavos, a Sharei Tshuva, Orchos Sadikim, Mesilas Yesharim. People would learn Musar. Hayasignon halimud hazeh b'tamu b'nigun limud gemara poskim. But they would learn it in the same way, with the same melody, as you would learn a Gemara or Halacha. O be'iyun b'habata levad. Or even just by analyzing it and thinking without actually verbalizing any of the words. However, Rabbi Yisrael, Hora Bina Vedas, he taught us a different derech, where he explained that in order to really have the toelis of the limud hamusar, the benefit, you have to have two components. One is the adiyah v'haskala, b'chachmas hayira, a real deep understanding and wisdom within the realm of MUSSAR. And the second thing was hisorus. There has to be an awakening. There has to be this inner transformation that the limud hamusar is not just an intellectual pursuit, but it's yecham levavo yispal nafsho, that it warms up the heart and it moves the spirit. V'yisorer bekirbo yires Hashem, and it brings within the inner being a real presence of a Kadosh Baruch Hu. So you have to have both the intellectual pursuit of MUSSAR, understanding it well, but also there has to be the emotional connection to those ideas. So how did he accomplish that? If you look at the last paragraph, Lazos letachlis kaniyas hayira. In order to acquire MUSSAR, nochot shetiya signon halimud besifrei MUSSAR behispalus hanefesh. The way we learn those MUSSAR works has to be different than the way we learn Gemara and Halacha. Belev nachon. Now this is actually quoting from Rav Yisrael. Belev nachon b'kol otsev bisfasayim dolkim. Lev nachon means a strong heart. B'kol otsev is, what's otsev? Otsev usually has the connotation of sadness. Okay, so we'll have to explore more what that means. But with the voice of, we'll call it atzvus, and leave it vague for now, with your lips aflame, laharchiv es harayun b'tzurei chushi, but not just to be singing the words, but to use it as this meditation of having the images of what I'm talking about and what I'm trying to accomplish for myself. It should be this vivid image happening in my head, ki koach hatzir moel mo'od lemusar, because having that real power of vision helps significantly when it comes to implementing MUSSAR. La'orer hanefesh berigsha seivarim, to awaken the soul through the feeling and the movement of the body. Limshoch bekirba devarim hanoade me'anshe gevia v'hanefesh. And this is going to be one of those points that need understanding. Rabbi Yisrael, when he speaks about the learning of MUSSAR and when he speaks about the methodology of how to learn MUSSAR with this hisorus, with this hislavus, he seems to focus on yira. And not just like a high level of yiras haromamus, but he focuses on yiras ha'onesh, which is much more of a basic motivation of, I want to do the right thing because I understand that there are consequences to action. Now, this is something that's very hard for most people to feel comfortable with and to use as a compelling motivation in our avodas Hashem, and likely for most, if this was the main focus of our avoda, that would lead to very unhealthy living and avodas Hashem. And we'll see this is going to be one of the main points that those who expressed concern or opposition to the MUSSAR movement, they pointed to this issue of why the intensity of thinking about yiras ha'onesh. But I'm pointing out that this is definitely one of his themes. So there definitely is a difference between the different schools of MUSSAR and how they branched out from after this initial breakthrough of Rabbi Yisrael. But within the actual writing of Rabbi Yisrael, this is definitely something that he talks about in many places. So that requires understanding. Okay?
It seems also that it's a disconnect from his whole experience with that elderly gentleman crossing the bridge. Right? That there's more of like a basic fundamental ethos as opposed to this very difficult, I don't know.
You're saying that in the story of him following and observing Rabbi Zundel Misalant, we don't get the impression.
Not even the bridge with the time. Like that.
Oh.
You know,
It's a very
like,
basic thing.
Yeah, it's like
He's so absorbed in year, he lost.
it just seems like it's whatever.
Meaning, why would he focus on yiras onesh if one of the main reasons he felt it was necessary to begin the MUSSAR revolution is because people were just being Masiach Das. They were totally spaced out to what's important in life, like answering someone's simple question. How does this approach address that problem? Okay, these are all good questions.
Is the Yiras HaOnesh coming from Rav Yitzchok, or his interpretation of his Rebbe, or is it all the students?
That's a good question. Is this the interpretation of Rav Yitzchok, or is this really what Rav Yisrael spoke about? The answer is this is exactly what Rav Yisrael spoke about. And we're going to see in next week's Shiur that when Rav Yisrael passed away and when Rav Yitzchok took over giving the drasha, he had a very different focus. And his focus was much more Avas Hashem. So, and that's a question that we'll explore next week. We could relate more to that maybe. It feels better, and it's harder to tap into Yiras HaOnesh, but what was the thought process of Rav Yitzchok? Why would he deviate from his Rebbe? And did his Rebbe not get it? Right? Did Rav Yisrael Salanter, the Gadol Hador, the father of MUSSAR, revered by all Gedolei Yisrael in his time and beyond, why was he focused so much? Almost, you could use the word, although it's probably not appropriate, why was he obsessed with this flavor of MUSSAR? So we'll get there, B'Yirtzeh Hashem. I just want to end off, though, as the hour is late, when Reb Yitzchok explains the methodology of the MUSSAR, he does point out that not everyone embraced the Limud HaMussar, and not everyone agreed with Reb Yisrael that it was really necessary. And there are two reasons for that. He actually has more, but these are two reasons that we have, at least for today. He says one reason is Reb Yisrael was working on a cure to Choli HaNefesh. Now, Choli HaNefesh is not a term that Reb Yisrael invented. That goes back to the language of the Rishonim, right? The Rambam speaks about Choli HaNefesh. So he's working on this cure. What's going to drive me to try to bring this MUSSAR concept into my life and be open-minded to somewhat of a new approach in how to learn MUSSAR that I never really saw my father or grandfather do? It's only if I have a sense of urgency. I have to find a cure. But, says Rav Yitzchok, if a person's not convinced that there's anything that requires healing, so then why would I take my time and effort in pursuing this refuah? I'm not in need of a refuah. And that's going to be, we'll see next week what the response was from Volozhin. When Rav Chaim Brisker said to Rav Yitzchok, we're not sick over here, we're good. We don't need the MUSSAR movement. So one issue is if we don't realize that we're struggling with the machla, we have no desire to hear innovative forms of refuah. The second factor is addressing this very issue of the focus. He says, Zo shenis, etzim ha-sugula shalim ha-musar, im ki kolelis cheshbonos rabim. Listen, learning MUSSAR, although there are many different things that we focus on, ulam yadua ki yesod bahu cheshbon ha-nefesh mi yiras ha-onesh lachshav cheshbono shalolam. But we know, at least in the MUSSAR of Rav Yisrael, that this idea of yiras ha-onesh, this very fundamental, seemingly lowly level of motivation, right? Reminding ourselves that there are consequences to actions and therefore I want to make sure to do the right thing, that's not very enjoyable to think about. He says, Bahashkafa Rishona, right, it would seem at first glance that this type of process, this type of focus, would just bring you to sadness and hopelessness and depression. What every human being wants more than anything is to feel a simcha sachayim. We want to feel a sense of strength and vigor and joy. And therefore, when we hear concepts encouraging us to learn Musar behispilus and to focus on some of these more depressing aspects of life and mortality, that's something we shy away from naturally and understandably. Now he says the truth is, if it's done the right way, it could bring incredible joy. But you have to have the patience to get there.
People not holding
If someone is what?
it. People were not holding it, but if they were, it would be a help. Positive.
Right. If one knew how to do it with the proper hadracha, the guidance. So he says it's true, it starts off mar, it starts off bitter, but as one continues, it becomes masuk, it becomes sweet, just like exercise, right? It starts off bitter, it's torturous, but theoretically, if you keep on doing it, it becomes something you look forward to, and you actually need it. I can't go a day without jogging. So Rav Yitzchok is saying we find the same thing in the realm of MUSSAR. Okay, but we're gonna leave off with some of these questions. Namely, on one hand, we have the incredible picture that was painted for us by Rav Kook 50 years after the passing of Rav Yisrael. We have Rav Yitzchok's thesis explaining and expanding upon Rav Yisrael's main innovation. Right, there is an A and a B. The A is the necessity of learning MUSSAR, and B, which was the main chiddush of Rav Yisrael, how to learn MUSSAR, which seems like a real new approach that was not done previously. At least it was never done in a systematic way. And then we'll leave off with the question of why the focus on Yira, why not focusing on Bein Adam L'Chavero and Avas Habrios and Avas Hashem. Why did Rav Yitzchok seem to change from the Masorah of his Rebbe? And then we'll analyze what was some of the concern that Rav Kook himself voiced and that we find from the Yeshiva in Volozhin and others. To be continued. Shkoyach.